Well, it's nice to see you all here this evening. I'm actually following very closely from the theme you just heard. I was asked to actually talk about how a culture can be created in an organization whereby you can learn to manage risk. Now, learning to manage risk in organizations is about learning to accept failure and manage failure when it happens and understand it. We don't make progress without learning to manage risk and take risk when we have to. Now, if you've worked all your life in the transport industry, which I have, and in the infrastructure industry, you have to learn a lot about risk. And it's not quite so prevalent, I think, in the IT industry. There is a deep fear of failure. I look quite often from a media perspective at the IT industry talking about itself. When, say, a government project goes wrong, maybe an NHS project to introduce IT into the NHS, and everybody's wringing their hands and blaming each other for it. The company that's doing it is blaming the government's blaming the company, the doctors are blaming the Tory party, and da-da. And you don't actually get to the answer as to what went wrong and how you manage your way out of it and how you progress. In the transport industry, we've learned how to do that. We've learned hard lessons along the way of a history of an industry, particularly in aviation, which went from being a pretty lethal industry in the 1920s to now the safest place to be in the world. There is nowhere safer on planet Earth to be than in a long-haul flight on BA or Virgin Atlantic from London to New York. You have less chance of dying than in any other single place. And that's a remarkable achievement. And trying to introduce that level of, let's put it, the interface between the technology and the human being to create a safety culture through learning to manage risk is something that we're now trying to take from the aviation industry and introduce into the marine industry, the car industry, the bus industry, the train industry. And that's what intelligent mobility is all about. And it's about learning about how to cope with failures along the way. The Virgin brand can go almost anywhere. I'm going to talk a little bit about Virgin's management of risk and understanding of failure. The culture of the company I joined in the 1980s. I worked for Virgin for 25 years until 2010. My last project, when I went part-time and began my non-exec career, was building the spaceship for Virgin Galactic and getting it into early test flight. It's just had a failure, as you all know. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what was the culture of this company that I joined, and what was it that I grabbed hold of when I joined it in the mid-1980s that made it a very successful organization and one with a worldwide reputation for being one of the best managers of safety in both the aviation and the rail industry? We have a stronger safety culture in those industries in which we're prevalent than almost any other operating organization. Virgin has never lost a passenger in an accident in 30 years of operation of 3 airlines across 3 continents. No other airline in the world can say that. The thing I like about Virgin is that the culture that I joined in the 1980s, the young company I joined, already had at its helm somebody who had no fear of failure. He's an individual, I think because Richard Branson has a bit of ADHD and was dyslexic, highly intelligent, but without much formal education, he absolutely ate and loved the idea of learning to manage risk, to succeed, to grow businesses. And he was very much in the mold of, President Roosevelt. There is nothing to fear but fear itself. When Roosevelt said that in the early 1930s, America was in a terrible place. Unemployment was 3 times the level in Britain. During the recession in the early 1930s in the United States, fear stalked that land. And 20 million people actually starved to death in America. Nobody in the British equivalent recession starved to death. We managed that risk of that massive recession very well as a country. We don't think of ourselves as having done it. We think of it as the road to Wigan Pier and the Jarrow Marches. But actually, we managed it very well. America didn't. And Roosevelt turned that round by making people understand that they had to get out of the culture of fear and they had to begin a culture of investing for the future. And I luckily joined a company where I had a boss who was just like that. One of the things that he did, and one of the things I learned, and you can apply it to lots of different ideas, But he understood the idea of corporate failure. So I'm not now talking about the failure of a piece of technology or the failure of an IT system, but corporate failure. And the way that Richard Branson learned to manage that, and he was one of the first people to do it, was to think of the idea of private equity and branded venture capital, as he called it. Split everything up, manage it in manageable units. Don't create a conglomerate. Very fashionable in the 1980s in Europe and North America was the idea of conglomerates, industrial conglomerates, a pyramidal holding company structure with hundreds of subsidiaries in all sorts of different businesses. What he did that was very different was he separated out every business. He believed that everything should be micromanaged down. He'd read a book called Small is Beautiful in the late 1960s, and he loved the idea of growing big by keeping each individual part small. So one of the first things I learned about managing failure is actually if you get a corporate culture where you can learn that you can compartmentalize little bits of failure and cope with those and then get through the solution to them, it's much easier. It was much easier for Virgin to manage, for instance, the tragedy at the Twin Towers with the way we structured our airlines differently. We had a long-haul airline called Virgin Atlantic that was severely hit. We had an airline in Australia that boomed as Australians didn't travel and travelled around Australia. And we were able to work on each problem separately because they each had separate management. We weren't trying to manage it as a worldwide airline. So the first thing I think about managing failure is keep the units small and keep control of what you're doing. And that applies to IT as it does to a corporate culture. There was a great guy, and it's well worth looking at his work, a great guy called Kelly. And Kelly was an engineer in 1946. And the problem the United States had in 1946 was that the Russians had stolen the British jet engine off the Merlin, and the Russians were building a thing called the MiG-15, and America only had Mustangs. And they were worried that Russia was going to be a nuclear power that could defeat them because they didn't have a jet aircraft. And a guy called Kelly set up a thing called Skunk Works at Lockheed Martin. You probably all heard of Skunk Works or heard the expression. And he had 14 rules to make a project work and manage through the failures to success. They were called Kelly's rules. And actually, when we built the spaceship for Virgin Galactic, I reenacted Kelly's rules in that project. I also used Kelly's rules when we were doing the Pendolino train for the West Coast Main Line, because they're a great way to manage a project, and it means taking accountability and responsibility. When you're managing a team of people to do a project, let's say it's an IT project, one person takes the heat. One person deals with the shareholder or the owner of the budget, and one person takes responsibility for the team and making sure they don't have to worry about those aspects of it, and make sure that person holds the team together. And he came up with all sorts of little tweaks in that. They're very interesting rules. You can find them online. My first taste of Virgin Atlantic was also about somebody who didn't fear failure. Richard Branson started Virgin Atlantic because he admired a guy called Sir Freddie Laker. Sir Freddie Laker had set up a company called Laker Skytrain, and it was actually Freddie Laker's license that Richard Branson bought to start Virgin Atlantic after Freddie Laker had been put out of business by British Airways. And actually, as opposed to fearing the failure of starting a long-haul airline in 1984, the reason he did it was because of Freddie's failure, because he wanted to succeed. And he admired Freddie so much he wanted to carry a talisman. And he went to Freddie Laker. I just was about to join Virgin Atlantic, and Freddie Laker came for a meeting after I joined and told Richard the 8 things he needed to do to succeed. And one of the things was to not put Sir Freddie's name on his first aircraft, which had been Richard's idea to name it after Sir Freddie Laker. He said, you don't want to name it after a failure. He said, name the 10th aircraft after me after you've succeeded, which you eventually did. But Freddie Laker said that basically to avoid failure, you need to combine quality and value for money. He failed to do that. So again, managing failure, again, is not just about a piece of technology working or not working, or the plane crashing or the train or that. It's about how you actually deal with the customer. So if you have a philosophy in an airline that's trying to compete in a very monopolistic market, and you either just go for value for money or just go to the top end for quality, Freddie Laker said you can't succeed. You've got to combine the two. So you've got to fill all parts of the plane, and you've got to have that quality aspect. And he failed to do that with Skytrain. You can see a little bit of that at the moment in Ryanair and EasyJet. EasyJet is finally breaking away from Ryanair, which is now trailing EasyJet in terms of its corporate growth and its market capitalization, because EasyJet has combined in the low-cost model a quality model as well. And Ryanair has not done that. So that was one of the next things I learned, was this idea of quality and value, and the idea of the consumer of your product is the person you're looking to avoid failure, not just your internal navel gazing. When you learn not to fail, one of the things that's really important is to have a culture in the organization. And one of the things that Richard Branson was incredibly good at creating in the 1980s in Virgin was a culture where he gave us the opportunity to try things out in a controlled way. I'll give you an example. There's an aeroplane here you can see in the bottom corner of this presentation. Let me just look at it. This aeroplane is called the Virgin Atlantic Global Flyer. A guy called Steve Fossett flew that around the world in a single tank of fuel. We built that plane entirely out of carbon composite, at a time when Airbus and Boeing told us you couldn't build a plane entirely out of carbon composite. If you tell Richard Branson he can't do something, it's the best way. I mean, if British Airways had thought about it and ignored him and said other things, he probably wouldn't have built the airline the way he did. But when he's given a challenge, and I remember the boss of Boeing saying you can't build a plane entirely out of carbon composite. So in 2004, we built the world's first ever entirely carbon composite aircraft and flew it around the world in a single tank of fuel. That inculcates a culture in the engineering of the company, which is about doing brave things, but compartmentalizing that risk, not putting that risk on the public, doing that as an experimental project. Much as Virgin Galactic is still an experimental project before it moves to its consumer phase in the next couple of years. Space. So, fear of failure. Fear of failure has stalked the space industry ever since the success of the Apollo missions. They were truly brave, to use the expression we've heard earlier. They thought they had a 1 in 3 chance of getting back, so they built 3 Saturn V's. Buzz Aldrin, I know Buzz Aldrin very well personally, they did not think they were going to come home. But they had no fear of that failure. They knew it was the road to success. As it was, the Apollo missions worked perfectly. It was remarkable. Even the famous Apollo 13 was a remarkable case of good management. In fact, there was an IT aspect to that as well, but it was a case of good management and getting them back alive. So the Apollo was a huge success. Then NASA went into a phase where it was no longer brave, it forgot the Kelly's rules, and it then feared failure so much it tried to over-engineer everything. The shuttle was a disaster of management of a project and management of a fear of failure, and it actually created failure. They were so scared of failing, they tried to build so many protocols in and so many safety systems, they ended up with a spaceship with 387,000 moving parts. And it didn't work very well. And it was very expensive, and of course, it tragically ended up failing. So the space industry is one where you have to look at it now, and you have to look at where it needs to go, because it's so important to your industry. IT is now absolutely tied up with the future of space. There's 28,000 satellites up there. We could put all of our server farms have now overtaken all of human transportation as a source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we could put those server farms in space, we could do amazing things. But we're trying to get there on 60-year-old technology that's incredibly expensive. So that's why space matters a lot. It also matters a lot because it's feeding us now. If it wasn't for the agricultural weather satellites and the GPS system, we'd be producing 12% less food than a decade ago, and we would be starving to death. So space matters even to that extent in our lives. So the idea of finding systems to get technology to space much more cheaply is the goal, and you have to have some failures along the way to move this very, very old, but relatively now safe technology forward. And America was very brave. In the 60s, they developed a space plane that worked. It flew 300 times into space. They abandoned it. They forgot all about it because it wasn't as exciting as the Apollo program getting to the moon. And when they abandoned that, they forgot about, actually, that is probably the safest way to get to space. And that's why the Virgin Galactic project largely came about. We looked at the history, and we looked at the easiest way and best way to do this. And the Virgin Galactic project was born, and it was design, it was research of what customers wanted. So it gives you a tourism experience. The tourism experience is helping to fund the development of the satellite launch system. The satellite launch system will fund the science system that's being developed for it. And so it becomes a science vehicle, a space tourism vehicle, and a transportation vehicle for 200 kilogram satellites to low Earth orbit. And it breaks the industrial mold of getting technology and IT into space much more cheaply than before. Now, this is a brave project. We pretty much knew something could go wrong. Tragically, there was an accident most of you have heard about, and it was probably, I mean, I'm pretty certain that the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board of the United States government, will come out and say it was sadly pilot error that caused that. There was nothing wrong with the technology. So they're 85% through building a second spaceship, and brave people are going to fly that, and they're going to make it work. And then it will fly people, and it will fly technology, and it will be part of a revolution that's being undergone at the moment by people like Elon Musk with SpaceX, Jeff Bezos at Amazon. The reason that people like Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, the Google brothers, and all of these different people are investing in space is because we need to be there if we're going to solve the problems of having 7 billion people going to 10 billion people, and we're going to make IT work for the planet and for people. We have to be doing it from space. It's a much better place to do most of this stuff because it's not going to kill the atmosphere. That is the spaceship when it was in its test mode. And that is my presentation. Thank you very much.